Why are some societies so much more successful than others? Why in the past did some countries rise while others faltered? Why do some societies, notably but not exclusively Western ones, innovate, contribute and prosper, while others stagnate, creating little more than squalor? When people first started to ask these kinds of questions, the first explanation provided was providence. That's to say that for most of human history, successful societies were thought to have benefited by being divinely favoured. Conversely, countries that failed or were defeated by more successful rivals were thought to have fallen out of favour with God, or even the gods. A second explanation as to why some societies are more successful is that they've got better access to natural resources or a more favourable climate or geography. One of the best known contemporary advocates of this type of explanation is Jared Diamond, author of the phenomenally successful Guns, Germs and Steel. He suggested that Eurasian civilizations arose because they had a more favourable climate and geography. Europe, according to Diamond, won the lottery in having plants and animals suitable for domestication, for example. It was the nature of the local fauna and flora that mattered, he implies, rather than anything in the nature of the people doing the domestication. I'm sceptical that winning the lottery in terms of access to natural resources explains why a particular people are successful. Mineral-rich Congo in Africa won the equivalent of the lottery jackpot Powerball with all its natural wealth. Yet instead of being a powerhouse, it's a basket case where the average person has an annual income of $650. If resources were the key, you'd expect fertile Ukraine to have thrived. Even before the current war there, it's long been one of the poorest places in Europe. On the other hand, Botswana in Africa wasn't blessed with much farmland. In fact, Botswana's famously arid and inhospitable. Yet Botswana is twice as wealthy as Ukraine was before the war, and is one of the most prosperous places in sub-Saharan Africa. Cold, gloomy Finland, with little fertile farmland, didn't win any lottery in terms of climate, yet the Finns are some of the richest people in Europe. Like winning the lottery, perhaps having the right geography or natural resources offers the opportunity to prosper. But unless the lottery winner happens to have other attributes, their good fortune is often squandered. Paul Kennedy's book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, made a big impression on me when I read it years ago. Kennedy offers a third explanation of why some societies rise, at least in military terms. He shows it's because of their underlying economic strength. Having brave armies or skillful generals was all very well, Kennedy showed, but the story of the rise and fall of great powers was really the story of having an economy that could equip and mobilize enough military muscle. Kennedy's economics is everything explanation is compelling, but it only takes us so far. If underlying economics explains why some countries emerge as dominant, what is it that explains why some countries take off economically in the first place? America might have eclipsed various European powers in the past century because she had a more powerful economy. But why has America consistently outgrown the others? The European powers might have eclipsed China as a great power in the 19th century because they had had an industrial revolution. But why didn't China have one at that time too? Noticing the way in which great increases in economic output are often accompanied by improvements in technology, some have suggested a fourth explanation. Innovation, they say, is the key. But again, if technology explains why some societies are more successful than others, why are they more innovative? Why did China, which invented gunpowder, printing, and the compass, fail to apply these ideas while Europeans were able to? Why has the United States innovated ahead of Europe? Why, for that matter, have some parts of the planet, such as sub-Saharan Africa, produced remarkably little technological innovation over the past few thousand years? Perhaps asking why some places are poor and relatively unsuccessful economically is the wrong question to ask. Maybe we should begin by recognizing that poverty and stagnation are the default human condition. Most people that have ever lived had only a subsistence existence. Most people until a couple of centuries ago used pretty much the same technology that their great-great-grandparents depended upon. Any advances tended to be painfully slow until a few hundred years ago in Europe. We shouldn't ask why poor, unsuccessful societies are poor and unsuccessful, but why the prosperous and innovative are different. Why in Europe, first I would argue in tiny Venice, then a little later in Holland and then England, did exceptional societies emerge capable of producing intensive economic growth? The answer to that is overwhelming. Societies successful at achieving intensive economic growth, where output expands faster than the number of people, are those in which the powerful are constrained and free markets are unconstrained. Trial and error is allowed to find new solutions. It was a relatively high degree of freedom that explains the emergence of Venice, the Dutch Republic, England, and then the United States as great economic, innovation, and ultimately military powers. It was the lack of freedom that explains why China, more advanced economically and technologically than Europe under the Song, slipped into centuries of backwardness under the Ming. Europe rose to global preeminence because, unlike China, or Turkey under the Ottomans, or India under the Mughals, there was no unified political authority capable of stifling innovation. Of course, not every great power has been a model of freedom. It's possible for a society to command resources by command and control for a while. The Ottoman Turks achieved military success under a system of extortion. Soviet Russia became a great power with a command economy. China under Mao mobilized millions. But without the free market, intensive economic growth is always elusive. Output might increase, but seldom in relation to what you put in. Of course, the idea of Western exceptionalism offends lots of people. Western academia is full of midwits desperate to find alternative explanations to account for the overwhelming success of Northwest European societies and their offshoots, rather than accept the reality of Western achievement. So they write fictional histories that try to downplay the fact that scientific innovation over the past millennia has overwhelmingly happened in the West. They argue that Western wealth was accumulated by exploiting the non-Western world, as though there was much wealth to be had there in the first place. The Dutch and the British didn't achieve intensive economic growth because they had overseas possessions. It was intensive economic growth that allowed the Dutch and the English to acquire those overseas possessions. Dutch and English per capita incomes had begun to rise long before either ventured to the East or the West Indies. If the Western ascendancy was not fueled by exploiting non-Western societies, what was it that made Western societies exceptional? Why were Venice, to some extent, and then the Dutch Republic to a larger extent, and finally England and America, able to constrain the powerful and unconstrain the free market? Today's fashionable school of thought says it was all about institutions. The two most famous institutionalists, Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson, authors of the global publishing phenomenon Why Nations Fail, put forward the intriguing theory that to thrive, a society needs what they call inclusive rather than extractive institutions. They chart at length the emergence of inclusive or extractive institutions in various societies and link it to how they fared economically. Maybe. But I can't help thinking that all these sorts of explanations miss a really important point. What about human behavior? Surely different human behaviors within different societies explains the different sorts of societies that we see. If we really want to know why some societies are more successful than others, should we not ask questions about the behavior of those that make up those societies? If instead of asking why a group of people was more successful than another, I was to ask why an individual person was relatively successful, we wouldn't begin by talking about institutions or the political economy, would we? When we try to account for an individual's achievements, we think in terms of their attributes and behavior traits. We might talk about their success in terms of their level of conscientiousness. We might consider their aptitude or how willing they were to work towards their goals and defer immediate gratification for future success. So why don't we consider such attributes and behavioral traits when we try to figure out why some societies have been more successful than others? What do I mean by attributes and behavior? I'm not going to attempt any sort of exhaustive list, but according to Jordan Peterson, one of the most important personal traits is conscientiousness. To what extent does someone pay attention to detail, work hard, honor their obligations, persist, and abide by social rules? Well, psychologists talk about personality traits. Economists talk about something similar when they talk about a person's time preferences. A person with a high level of conscientiousness and a low level of impulsiveness is likely to have more productive time preferences. That's to say, they'll be willing to defer gratification, willing to invest in studying, work, and relationships to build a better future. Having productive time preferences could mean not going out this weekend in order to be better prepared for the week ahead. Or it might mean being prepared to spend years at medical school with a low standard of living in return for one day being able to enjoy a physician's salary. It could mean being prepared to wait for the right partner. To suggest that different societies or groups within a society achieve different outcomes because of different behavior traits is a modern heresy. Why? Because it conflicts with the underlying postmodern materialist orthodoxy of our age. Postmodern materialists believe that humans are interchangeable. Postmodern historians would have us believe that people were interchangeable in the past. Insofar as there might be different behavior traits between different societies or groups within society, we're required to buy into the notion that it's just a consequence of different material conditions and the different environments in which each of us has lived. To take a specific example, the postmodern materialist orthodoxy holds that some societies are more crime-ridden than others, and some groups within a society are more prone to commit crimes due to their impoverished economic circumstances. Criminals, it's almost implied by those who make our criminal justice policy, are the victims of their disadvantaged circumstances. Deal with the underlying socioeconomic disadvantages, the postmodernists insist, and there will be less crime. To be clear, there is indeed a well-established correlation between low economic status and higher propensity to crime. But we can prove that it's not impoverished material circumstances that explains why some people commit more crime. A 2023 Swedish study by David Cesarini and Eric Lidquist asked, does wealth inhibit criminal behavior? And it looked at what happened when money was randomly distributed to people, in this case winners of the Swedish lottery. Did the winners of the lottery go on to commit more or less crime? If poverty predisposed people to commit crime, you would expect to see a rapid decline in criminality by lottery winners. In fact, the Swedish study showed no such trend at all. A sudden improvement in material circumstances did nothing to reduce criminal behavior whatsoever. For the postmodern materialists, the underlying explanation for different outcomes is, well, material. More criminality, they hold, is due to socioeconomic deprivation. But we can see that this is just not true. How people behave is not purely a function of their material condition. Maybe their material condition is more often a reflection of their behavior. Differences in underlying behavior explain why someone is poorer and why they're more likely to commit crime. Might different underlying behavior, conscientiousness, time preferences, levels of trust, in different societies explain why some societies are more successful than others? Wrong, will scream the postmodernist elite. Even if there are differences in things like time preferences, there's just too much variation within a society to make it matter, they will insist. There will, they say, be more variation in the levels of conscientiousness within a single family, think of teenage boys, than exists between different people in different societies. Sure, I get all that. There's plenty of variation. But a society is the sum of the individuals that make it. It's possible to measure behavioral traits in aggregate, in particular groups within society and between societies. The issue is not, is there lots of variation, but is there an aggregate difference between groups in society and between different societies? Clearly there is. Here's a map that shows time preferences around the world. Dark blue means productive time preferences, shorthand for high levels of conscientiousness. Dark red means the opposite, poor time preferences. Sure, there may be plenty of variation from the averages in any country on the map, but there are also significant aggregate differences between different societies. What else do you notice about this map? Northern Europe, especially Scandinavia, and by extension North America and Australia, have very productive time preferences. So too, incidentally, does Botswana, which, as I noted previously, is one of the richest places in Africa, and seems to have better time preferences than France. If behaviour's not down simply to our material circumstances, but our material circumstances reflect, at least in part, our behaviour, we can't ignore differences in behaviour in explaining why some societies are more successful than others. People, it turns out, really aren't so interchangeable. And if people are not interchangeable today, what makes us imagine people in different societies were interchangeable in the past? One of the most uplifting stories I've read recently was about the Sagrada Familia Cathedral in Barcelona. Apparently, after 142 years of construction efforts, it's almost close to being completed. Imagine what kind of time preferences it takes to build not only great buildings like that, but great societies. Not all societies have or have had it within them to do that. Some societies really are more successful than others, producing more intensive economic growth, more innovative ideas and artistic accomplishments than others. Maybe culture reflects these differences in underlying behaviour as much as it accounts for them. Here's a map showing levels of social trust around the world. Levels of social trust, a key aspect of culture, seem to correlate, at least to some extent, with time preferences. There's much more than merely an unequal distribution of great buildings around the world. Behaviour traits seem to be unequally distributed too. Of course, the only way to perpetuate the postmodern fiction that people are interchangeable is to ignore reality, to rewrite the history of Western ascendancy as a story of exploitation rather than elevation, to gloss over the true source of almost all human innovation over the past 10,000 years, to wallow in the absurd postmodern fallacy that conflates high art with dross, and great artistic attainment with crude primitivism, and to pretend that unequal outcomes in society today are a consequence of unequal opportunity, rather than a reflection of differences in the way different people behave. Why are some societies more successful than others? Why are outcomes between certain groups unequal within society? A big part for the explanation has got to be behavioural differences. This truth doesn't ultimately care about postmodern feelings.